So you may remember back when Barack Obama was president that there were these conspiracy theories that were cited with no evidence that maybe President Obama wouldn't relinquish control of the White House. He wouldn't leave the presidency. He might try to change the law to allow presidents to continue to run indefinitely, or he might do something to the Constitution, of course, not understanding what that would entail. Maybe President Obama would declare martial law and suspend the 2016 election. And of course, there was no reason to think that would happen because President Obama never mentioned anything about it. There was no actual evidence that it was something he would do. And it was very clear that there was a full election taking place and that Barack Obama was not going to seize indefinite control of the Oval Office. Still insanely unlikely that Donald Trump would do something like it. But in contrast to under Barack Obama, Donald Trump has actually said after China changed the law to allow the president to continue running, Trump said president for life sounds pretty interesting. Maybe it's something that we would do here in the United States in the future. Donald Trump has implied before that if he were to lose a presidential election, it could only be by fraud. You might remember that during the 2016 election, he was actually asked, if you lose, will you accept the results? And he said, well, we'll see, not even willing to say, yeah, if I lose, I lost. And then to add to all of this, Donald Trump's own former personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, said during his testimony last week that he fears Donald Trump will not peaceably transfer power if he loses the 2020 election. Let's take a listen to that clip.
And I will not sit back, say nothing, and allow him to do the same to the country. Indeed, given my experience working for Mr. Trump, I fear that if he loses the election in 2020, that there will never be a peaceful transition of power. And this is why I agreed to appear before you today.
So tons of people emailing me saying, how could a president even try to stay in power? Like, how could he try not to leave? Who would actually remove him? So let's actually play it out. There's a few primary scenarios here. So let's take it seriously. Let's deal with it once, and then we can sort of move on. The first example is like the simplest one. Imagine that there's some kind of psychotic episode, a mental health thing, where Trump is refusing to leave, but is not coherently contesting the results of the election and his administration's not contesting it. That's the simplest situation. I think Secret Service just removes Trump, maybe with mental health professionals. Like, I don't think that that's really the most complicated scenario. I also don't think it's the most likely scenario. What we're really talking about here is that the election is close, maybe it's contested, and ultimately Donald Trump, as well as his administration and staff, decide they don't believe Trump actually lost. You'd have a president-elect. You'd have that president-elect in touch with the FBI and the Secret Service and the Justice Department and the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the military, and there would be a physical removal of the president, period. It's insane. It's crazy. But in a situation like that, that's how it would go down. But that gets us to the importance of the military. And again, I'm doing this because people are emailing about it. I'm doing it because Michael Cohen suggested that it would happen last week, not because I think this is a likely scenario. Authoritarians being able to stay in power often comes down to support by the military. If we talk about Venezuela, for example, ultimately, whether Nicolas Maduro stays or goes could come down to whether the military backs Nicolas Maduro. If indeed the military backed Trump not leaving power, then you are all of a sudden talking about a coup d'etat, right? A coup by the state. Is that likely? I don't think so. This is something that is often said about other presidents. They're never going to leave the White House. They're going to refuse to relinquish control. And it's bogus. And here it's also probably bogus. The difference is we have Trump's statement about maybe accepting election results. We have Trump's statement about it sounds pretty good, president for life. And we have Michael Cohen's statement here. So, Pat, for the good of the country, I hope that it never actually comes to this. But I think that those are the ways that it would play out if it did come to that point in time. I can't imagine that if there is a decree from a Supreme Court or from a Federal Elections Commission or whatever, that Donald Trump has lost, I don't know how the military supports Trump just staying in power.
I think that our system of checks and balances here in the U.S. is strong enough so that even if Trump decides that he's not going to concede, it won't matter at the end of the day because he'll be taken out one way or another. But I don't think it'll come to that because Trump has shown signs that he's willing to cave when he knows that he's lost, like on family separations and the government shutdown recently. So I don't think it'll come to that. He may refuse to attend the inaugural of whoever defeats him, but I think that's about it.
Yeah, I think the most likely scenario is that this is not a thing, but since Michael Cohen mentioned it, and there's actually more to make us think about it than with any recent president I can think of. We've talked about it. That's how it would work. And now we can move on to bigger and better things. I want to have with you today what I hope will be an adult conversation, a serious conversation. And it's a conversation where I want to put aside sort of the partisan politics of evaluating how the current administration is faring. It's a separate discussion from any particular political issue. It's a separate discussion from the perception of Donald Trump internationally, which happens to be very embarrassing, but that's not what I actually want to talk about today. We have to start really thinking about the Trump mental health concerns that are increasingly prevalent and a topic of discussion. We did a number of interviews over the last year and a half, sort of generally about this. We did an interview about Donald Trump's mental health deteriorating with Dr. John Gartner. We that interview got more than 500,000 views, clearly a topic that resonated with a lot of people. We did another interview where we had a psychiatrist indicating that actually Donald Trump's mental condition is dangerous. We did an interview where the focus was on the impact of Donald Trump's narcissism and how that presents a danger in terms of thinking about his role as president of the United States. And this is a serious enough issue where every time we talk about it, more and more mental health professionals get in touch with me and they say, yeah, David, you really need to keep talking about this. So we're actually working on getting Dr. John Gartner back on the program because unfortunately, and I do say this seriously, I'm honest when I say it's unfortunate, there's evidence that this is getting worse. And Twitter last night, another indication of the instability. I don't know if we say it's mental illness or cognitive decline, but it's certainly the erratic emotional instability of the president lashing out in a series of tweets and retweets targeting even relatively unimportant people in the grand scheme of things. For example, Tom Steyer, a rich dude who's been talking about impeaching Donald Trump for a while. Nice guy, I'm sure, successful in his career. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not super clear why Donald Trump cares that much about Tom Steyer. Donald Trump last night tweeting, quote, "Weirdo Tom Steyer doesn't have the guts or money to run for president. He's all talk." Behavior very unbecoming of the president of the United States of America. Donald Trump also last night retweeting an article from the Washington Examiner, a just totally outrageous right-wing publication. It was a Donald Trump Jr. post, which Donald Trump retweeted. And once again, the Jim Jordan, the guy who is quoted in the article, a completely disgraced and not credible extremist right-wing Republican. And again, why is Donald Trump doing this? Why is this what he's spending his time doing? We don't know. Then retweeting Don Jr.'s post of an article from the straight-up conspiracy website Zero Hedge, suggesting a conspiracy about British intelligence officer, former British intelligence officer, Christopher Steele, who you might remember was the researcher on the Trump-Russia dossier, another Trump enemy. And then tweeting about a dude named Hans von Spakovsky from the right-wing Heritage Foundation, known for his efforts to suppress voting via all sorts of voter ID and other rules that he supported. His dad happens to be Russian, doesn't seem particularly relevant to our conversation today. Donald Trump there tweeting that Hans von Spakovsky has said he's not seen evidence that Donald Trump has violated the law, and suggesting that Adam Schiff is like a modern day Joseph McCarthy. Of course, Adam Schiff, the Democrat in charge of the House Intelligence Committee. This is not the pattern of someone who is thinking clearly. This is not a rational person under any circumstances, but this is no random Twitter troll, right? This is the president of the United States. Is he taking on the behavior of a trapped rat trying to figure out whether to abandon ship and drown in the ocean or wait it out and ultimately go down with the ship? And that is where increasingly my attention is going. This noose of criminality is closing around Donald Trump. 2/3 of Americans now believe that Donald Trump is a criminal. I'll get to that polling data momentarily. And Trump is now straight up doing his Richard Nixon, I am not a crook, tweeting just a couple of days ago, quote, I am an innocent man being persecuted by some very bad, conflicted, and corrupt people in a witch hunt that is illegal and should never have been allowed to start, and only because I won the election despite this great success. Innocent people normally welcome investigations that will clear them. Innocent people want investigations that will clear them to be carried out without interference and without obstruction so that they can be cleared. They don't do everything under the sun, including committing more crimes, to stop those investigations. This is not the behavior of an innocent person, but more importantly, this is not the behavior of a mentally healthy or stable person. And we're going to be talking to Dr. John Gartner about this again coming up pretty soon. The Conservative Political Action Conference, known as CPAC, was held this weekend. We're going to be looking at a bunch of different clips from it. We'll start with clips from Donald Trump's speech, and then later we'll get to a whole bunch of other speeches and panels that took place. It'll be sort of up to you to figure out what's the wackiest of the entire gong show. But when we think about the Trump speech first, I want to call your attention to the fact that in many ways, Donald Trump is becoming more and more authoritarian. Obviously, there's the cozying up to other authoritarians and being hugely impressed by people like Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un and fighting more and more with our allies like France and Canada and Germany. And we've talked about the attacks on the media as the enemy of the people. There's the mention that he's made before of liking the idea of maybe allowing president for life in the United States, the way that China has moved in the direction of doing. There's the dismissal of all facts and the creation of completely fact-free narratives that make Trump sort of authoritarian. And I could go on, but a really interesting trait that Trump is adopting is longer and longer speeches. And this is just a classic authoritarian move. Fidel Castro was known for endless speeches in Cuba. Putin has done 5-hour call-in shows. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela would ramble on for 4, 5, 6, even 8 hours in some cases. And there's a couple interpretations of why authoritarians do this. One is they genuinely believe that people are interested in hearing from them for that long. It's sort of like a narcissism, and I think Trump has no shortage of that. Another point of view on long authoritarian speeches is that it's a way to control the public, right? You're not going to get up and leave during the great leader's speech, and it's a way to exert control over the population. Another idea is that when authoritarians sense that they're in trouble or that there are threats, they go longer and longer in their speeches, and you could certainly argue that Donald Trump's presidency is under threat right now. In any case, that gets us to CPAC over the weekend, and Donald Trump gave a record-long speech, more than 2 hours long, and he absolutely lost it in front of a crowd of total sycophants. First, Donald Trump coming out, hugging the American flag, which is just this total sideshow thing that he's done a few times now. Yeah, by the way, the country music, I have to comment on the country music. How dumb and gullible are you to believe that Donald Trump, a rich guy who grew up in New York City and wants everything gold-plated, how dumb and gullible do you have to be to believe that he now likes country music and identifies it as a Republican? And I'm curious whether people agree with me. I believe that privately, this is a persona Trump knows is totally bogus. I believe that privately, Trump knows that hugging a flag is stupid, but he also knows enough to realize that the CPAC audience absolutely loves Trump hugging a flag, and they do. They actually think it's extraordinary, and they went completely bonkers. So then Trump gets into his actual 2-hour speech, and he goes after Robert Mueller in an unhinged tirade. Trump swears in the clip, and by the way, just so everybody knows, it's okay to air this. No one's going to get fined by the FCC for airing the president's words. Take a listen to this.
Unfortunately, you put the wrong people in a couple of positions, and they leave people for a long time that shouldn't be there. And all of a sudden, they're trying to take you out with bullshit, okay? With bullshit.
Oh, man. And the crowd just loving the fact that the president is not going to kowtow to political correctness. He'll swear if he wants to swear. Of course, what he's saying makes absolutely no sense. He appointed most of the people that have been involved in one way, shape, or form, and saying everything that's going on in terms of the investigation is totally above board and legal and constitutional. Then Trump just starts making things up about immigration. And listen to the bizarre claim he makes about birth control here.
But mothers who love their daughters give them massive amounts of birth control pills because they know their daughters are going to be raped on the way up to our southern border. Think of that. True story. Told to me by the Border Patrol.
Yeah, massive amounts of birth control pills. How is he this dumb? Either you're taking birth control or you're not, right? Massive amounts, as if taking more than the prescribed amounts are effective in some way. And then maybe most cryptically, most disturbingly, Donald Trump claimed during this 2+ hour long CPAC speech that he is going to be signing an executive order requiring colleges to support free speech. What does that even mean? We don't know. Trump obviously doesn't know, but it didn't stop him from saying it.
Announce that I will be very soon signing an executive order requiring colleges and universities to support free speech if they want federal research dollars.
Trump's reaction and that of the crowd suggests everybody knows what this means, but nobody has any idea what it means. Trump doesn't know what it means. What does it mean that he will sign an executive order requiring the support of free speech? I was thinking back and actually watched over the weekend some old CPAC videos. There was a time when CPAC was actually about conservative ideas. They were ideas I disagreed with vehemently, but they were ideas that you could argue in the sort of spirit of the Hegelian dialectic, or of having different views, a sort of yin-yang. We need a force that is for progress, and we need a force that prevents us from going too far too fast, right? You could have some sort of more neutral point of view on the idea of a party that is for moving forward and changing everything, and a party that says, let's be a little cautious. I can get behind the value of conservatism in that sense, even though I would disagree with the ideas. This is no longer that, okay? CPAC is propaganda. It's red meat. It's the weaponization of ignorance. And I saw a tweet over the weekend that really sort of exemplified how we should be thinking about this. This is like Trump at CPAC for 2 hours is like a crazy guy screaming on the subway for 2 hours, except the guy has access to nuclear weapons. And that's an extraordinarily scary thought, but it's the reality. That's the reality we're working with. And the reality is an increasingly erratic, unhinged, unpredictable, but also authoritarian Donald Trump. I have to hand it to Chris Wallace on Fox News. He now has a fairly extensive repertoire of solid interviews with Trump officials where he just doesn't let them get away with their BS. I've talked about the failings of our debate system earlier in the show. Our presidential debates are a format that doesn't really allow for follow-up. It doesn't really allow people to be forced into more specifically defending their claims or to be called out when they make conflicting claims. Chris Wallace actually does a good job of this sometimes on Fox News. And this gets us to this weekend, where Donald Trump's war-hungry national security advisor, John Bolton, spoke to Chris Wallace and tried to defend Donald Trump's behavior and actions related to Kim Jong-un. Now, remember, Trump's first summit with Kim Jong-un in Singapore, miserable failure. Nothing came out of it. Trump declared victory, that the nuclear threat is over. Of course, nothing actually happened after that. They have a second summit, this time in Vietnam. Trump goes, gets nothing. The negotiations end without an iota of progress. Trump praises Kim Jong-un, says he takes him at his word about not knowing about how American Otto Warmbier was being tortured. Trump eats it all up, and it's an international embarrassment. Every single time that Trump praises these dictators and shows that he's totally dominated by them, it is an international embarrassment. Putin said he didn't meddle, and he seemed serious when he said it, but he's a great guy, and he's a strong guy. Kim Jong-un says he had no idea about Warmbier, but he's a really bright and funny and remarkable guy, and we're having a great relationship together. So Chris Wallace calls out John Bolton about it, and he says, hold on a second, Trump believes this stuff? And John Bolton goes into a word salad, stuttering all over the place, completely incoherent, and Bolton tries to say that I take him at his word just means I believe that this is what he said, which of course is of no meaning. Take a look.
This is not the first time that the president has taken the word of an autocrat over outside evidence.
He's not taking the word. He said, when he says, I'm going to take him at his word, it doesn't mean that he accepts it as reality. It means that he accepts that's what Kim Jong-un said.
So when he says, I take him at his word, it doesn't mean that he believes Kim Jong-un?
Well, that's what he said. I think one way to prove that is to give the United States a complete account.
Okay, so take him at his word doesn't mean I believe him. It just means he believes he said this, which means nothing since they were in the room together. Similar situation on CNN, but there they play another important part of what Trump said, not just the I take him at his word part, but actually I don't believe that Kim Jong-un would have allowed this to happen. How does Trump know that? Apparently because his relationship with Kim Jong-un is so great.
I want to play what President Trump said about Kim Jong-un and the brutal mistreatment of the American college student Otto Warmbier, who was arrested in North Korea and returned to the United States in a coma, and he subsequently died. Take a listen.
I don't believe that he would have allowed that to happen. He tells me that he didn't know about it, and I will take him at his word.
He's going to take Kim Jong-un at his word that he didn't know about it. The Warmbier family put out a statement. They disagree. They say Kim Jong-un is responsible. Are they wrong?
Look, the president made it very clear he considers what happened to Otto Warmbier an act of brutality that's completely unacceptable to the American side. I've heard him before the summit itself, before the press conference, talk about how deeply he cared about Otto Warmbier and his family. The fact is, the best thing North Korea could do right now would be to give us a full accounting of what happened and who was responsible for it.
Well, Trump believes it was brutal. What happened? How is that even a statement? What does that even mean? I don't believe that he would have allowed it to happen. He does this stuff all the time. Kim Jong-un is known for doing exactly this type of stuff all the time. And Bolton says the best thing would be for Kim Jong-un to give us a full accounting of what happened. Why is that the best thing for Kim Jong-un? Kim Jong-un convinced Trump that he knew nothing about what was going on with Otto Warmbier, and that he certainly had nothing to do with it. He already convinced Trump. Why on earth would Kim Jong-un now give us an actual full accounting of what happened to Otto Warmbier? There's no incentive whatsoever for him to do that, since he already convinced Trump. And Jake Tapper tries to follow up on this.
Do you take Kim Jong-un at his word?
The president takes him at his word.
No, I know he does, but what about you?
My opinion doesn't matter. My opinion is that I'm the
national security advisor of the president.
Right,
your opinion matters quite a bit.
I am not the national security decision maker. That's his view.
A total cop-out, but more importantly, Bolton is one of the most hawkish clowns of the last 15 years of neocon American politics. When Bolton does these milquetoast defenses of Kim Jong-un, you know the entire order of things is just backwards. And it really seems as though Bolton was brought in to be a sort of neutered version of himself under Donald Trump. That's actually not all bad, because a neutered John Bolton might actually prevent his war-hungry nature from convincing Trump to start more wars, it's just very strange and hard to understand. A genuinely bad, stubborn guy who appears totally dominated by the Trump regime of idiocy and cognitive dissonance. I'm curious as to why, although anything that prevents more wars from being started is something that in total I have to admit is good. Make sure you're following The David Pakman Show on Instagram at David Pakman Show, where you can vote on upcoming show topics. And check out some of the behind the scenes pictures, by the way, that I have up on my Instagram page at david.pakman. We'll take a quick break. The conclusion to my interview with the very homophobic Dr. Paul Cameron is coming up next. So that's Trump at CPAC. Let's now talk about everybody else at CPAC, just to sort of close the loop on it, closing the loop on the weaponization of ignorance. I have a clip for you that is a mere 72 seconds long, where there are 5 people competing for the dumbest comment of the entire weekend at CPAC. On stage, you have Donald Trump Jr., you have Charlie Kirk from Turning Point USA, you have Donald Trump Jr.'s, I guess his girlfriend, former Fox News anchor Kimberly Guilfoyle, and then 2 other clowns. I think one guy is Matt Schlapp, and then some other woman. You don't even have to know who they are, but they are all on the CPAC stage trying to be clever. CPAC 2019 set the record for the dumbest comments that the crowd went absolutely bonkers for. Quick note, a lot of lip service paid to guns at CPAC. Of course, it's a gun-free zone, no guns allowed. Why? Because it would be insane to let thousands of conservatives carrying guns into a room with each other, obviously. So all about guns, no guns allowed at CPAC. That gets us to some of the panels. Check out this first video and tell me, who do you think is the dumbest here?
3 weeks ago tomorrow, we had our second granddaughter. And like I said a few weeks ago, yeah, and her name is Reagan. How presidential is that? Beautiful Reagan Elise.
I lobbied for Trump, but it was a little too soon, maybe, so we'll see.
Trump is not the most feminine name, but we can make it.
Hey, you know,
but neither is Reagan.
We're going to take a page out of the liberal playbook. It doesn't matter. You know, it doesn't matter. We can identify how we want.
Okay, so, I mean, I guess you can call your kid whatever you want, obviously. I guess the joke is that it's a reference to trans people existing, and that, I guess, counts as funny during CPAC on the CPAC stage in front of that crowd. So now we continue with this new grandmother explaining gender to the crowd.
By the way, she is a daughter. She's our granddaughter. And we're raising her as a girl.
She's beautiful.
We're not letting her have a choice. She's what God designed.
There will be outrage tomorrow that you decided for her.
God makes the choice of what the babies are going to be, and God decided she would be a girl.
You know.
So this is just straight up transphobia, right? I mean, this is a dumb conversation. It's a very stupid conversation. And by the way, she's going to have a choice. I hate to break it to you. Someday she'll be an adult and she'll be able to make decisions for herself, unless you literally enslave the girl. So now it's getting very, very dumb. Like, this outdoes Donald Trump Jr. But then I think it gets even dumber than what Don Jr. said, but it comes from the other dude on stage. Take a listen.
You don't have to raise them as a girl. She's got a little baby doll right under her arm every second.
Yeah.
And when my boys always had guns in their hands. So we didn't, that's not something.
Hashtag me too.
That's not something you teach them. That's something they're born with. But as far as those cows you mentioned, I've got 100 cows. You just let Alexandria Cortez show up at my house and try to take my cows away.
Yes.
So,
I love cows, Jerry. They're delicious.
Yeah, so that's Jerry. That's not Matt Schlapp. I don't know who that guy is. Is that Jerry Falwell Jr.? I don't even know. I have no clue who that guy is. But what he's saying is, if a baby holds a doll, they will be a woman. And his kids held guns, so they are men. And then he talked about what Alexandria Cortez, I don't know who that is, Alexandria Cortez, referring to AOC, obviously. AOC recently said it would be better if everybody ate fewer burgers. And now there's this meme that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wants to take people's cows. And it's a real Sophie's choice here, trying to say who said the most ignorant stuff here. And I don't know, Pat, whether the most disturbing element of this is that CPAC chose to make this a panel, or that CPAC was right, the audience would love it, and they did.
I think the most disturbing element is that Donald Trump Jr. thinks he's a comedian now. Like, we know from the Michael Cohen testimony that Trump thinks that his own son has the worst judgment of all time. I think that comes true. That rings true when he's trying to make jokes there and they completely fall flat. Other people had to fake laughs in order for it to keep going.
Yeah, I mean, just sucking the air directly out of the room. So that's that panel, but that's not all. Then we get to this outrageous Congressman Mark Meadows, who literally brought in a black woman as a political prop during the Michael Cohen hearings. He opened up also by talking about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez conspiracies and Chick-fil-A.
You know, with this Green New Deal, they're trying to get rid of all the cows. But I've got good news. Chick-fil-A stock will go way up because we're going to be eating more chicken, all right? I mean, so...
Okay, and then Ted Cruz also talking about killing cows, which really seems to miss AOC's point altogether, obviously.
I hope to see PETA supporting the Republican Party now that the Democrats want to kill all the cows.
Chicken and beef now, the subject of CPAC. Chicken and beef. Really an entire weekend of idiocy, weaponized ignorance, cognitive dissonance, and unfortunately, people who came away feeling invigorated. This stuff, I've been to conventions like this. People experience this stuff and they come away invigorated. Like it was just the most amazing experience. It's almost like a spiritual experience for people who attend. And they now come out strengthened, their beliefs strengthened, that their harebrained ideas and completely backwards logic and morality is the way forward. And I would not be surprised if it actually leads to more erratic behavior in the real world, not just from the people who attended, but also from the speakers, because you go out there and you see this rabid crowd hungry for transphobia and jokes about socialism and communism and all this stuff. They come away like, wow, our movement is really something. We are now going to get even wackier in the real world. And that's already what you're seeing in the short time since this event. I'm on Twitter if you want to send me your thoughts. What exactly is the defining characteristic of CPAC in your mind? I'm on Twitter at @DPakman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. We've been talking about the increasing role of Fox News in the immoral fiasco that is the campaign and presidency of Donald Trump. And I've got two Fox News stories for you today. Shortly, second story on today's show, we've learned that Fox News actually had the Stormy Daniels story, which includes multiple crimes for which people have now been convicted before anybody else had it, before the election of President Donald Trump. And for political reasons, they killed the story. They didn't run it. That's going to be the second story on today's show. But before we even get to that, there are now allegations that Fox News actually gave Donald Trump debate questions in advance of the debate that they hosted back in 2015. And before I give you the details, it's really important to understand the context here, okay? Remember that the right went crazy when it was alleged that Democratic DNC staffer Donna Brazile passed a potential town hall question to Hillary Clinton. And it's a question mark whether it was really even a question or a topic. Now, either way, it was wrong to do that. As a DNC staffer that supposedly is an unbiased arbiter of the Democratic primary, what Donna Brazile did is wrong. It shouldn't have happened. But the right went bonkers, and it may have been dealing just with a topic rather than a question. And in fact, Trump specifically raged against CNN when that news broke. You might remember that in the first debate that Fox News did in 2015, however, there were so-called tough questions from Megyn Kelly. And there are now two Fox News insiders, plus Jane Mayer, whose investigative work on this has just been absolutely top-notch, who say that Roger Ailes, who at the time was the Fox News CEO, told the Trump campaign what the questions would be from Megyn Kelly during that debate. Now, I want to be really clear here. There's a lot of informational spin happening around this. There are counterclaims saying that actually Donald Trump wasn't really given anything. He wasn't even getting along with Fox News Channel at the time, so why would they want to help him? There are counterclaims that Donald Trump was given questions in advance of the debate, but they ended up not being asked. They were either questions that were dropped or they were bogus questions, questions that were never going to be included. And then there are also counterclaimants that, yes, someone fed Trump questions in advance, but they were asked by other people, and it wasn't the, quote, tough Megyn Kelly questions that he was fed. That's not really the most important thing here, okay? So let's go through this in a kind of logical, methodical progression. First of all, is it possible or even likely that Donald Trump was fed questions in advance of the Fox News debate? Of course, right? Megyn Kelly even said so 2 years ago. That's not actually the notable thing. Trump still performed like a moron, but it was the type of moron that some Republicans loved enough to ultimately make him president of the United States. It wasn't because he was fed questions from Fox that he became president. Despite being fed questions, he still made a fool out of himself, and it didn't matter because Republicans voted for him anyway. So that part is actually less interesting. As far as Fox News is concerned, yeah, Fox is the propaganda arm of the Trump administration today, almost exclusively. Yeah, Shep Smith is an outlier. Chris Wallace is an outlier. But feeding questions to Trump would be both not surprising and also not even necessary for Fox to be what they are today, which is a de facto mouthpiece for the Trump administration, with Sean Hannity at the top of that sort of hierarchy of propaganda. What's the real issue here? The real issue for me is that this is another opportunity for me to mention that the way these debates are set up doesn't help us figure out who the best candidate is. That's what debates should do. And that's not really what this story is about, but in a way it is, because whether or not the questions were fed to Trump, candidates knowing the questions ahead of time is a very small piece of why these debates are BS in total. These debates are structured in a way where the only outcome is that you either do the Trump thing, which is insult people and say things about Rosie O'Donnell and other people, little Marco and Rand Paul's physical appearance, and call people low energy and try to score points that way. Or you try to score points by just listing talking points, because fundamentally the debates are structured to have weak moderators in almost all cases and in most ways. They are way too short in terms of how long each person is allowed to speak to get into any substance. And that's maybe as a result of the low attention span that many news consumers have at this point. And it's just too easy to gish gallop, which means just throw a whole bunch of stuff out there at once, misstate the positions of your opponents or claim that your opponent is misstating your positions, and nothing substantive actually happens. Here's one example. Not even from the Trump era. The first Mitt Romney-Barack Obama debate. Mitt Romney spent half the debate claiming that Barack Obama was simply mischaracterizing his points of view and his positions, even though Barack Obama was accurately characterizing Mitt Romney's points of view and positions, and it avoids any real and substantive debate, but it's not even fully exposed because the format is too short to even really let us hash that out. Here's an example of a specific topic where we often learn nothing. Taxes, okay? When candidates debate taxation, it's we should cut taxes for the middle class, or we should raise taxes for the very rich. Everybody needs to pay their fair share. We are overtaxed. Get into exactly what your brackets would be, what would the percentage marginal tax rates be, and debate why that's the plan that you want. Because if you actually allow the time for that to happen, it will be very obvious which candidates don't have the slightest idea what's going on, which is a lot of them. It would be surprising how many of them that is. You need real-time fact-checking. That has to be something that is done. It's not partisan. It's merely reality. You need to empower the moderators to be stronger. Both parties often will negotiate to weaken the role of the moderator by limiting what the moderator or moderators are allowed to do. What we have, and I get it, we started with Trump got questions ahead of time. Okay, what we have are debates that, if anything, disinform people about actual issues, and they encourage a total lack of critical thinking. And this is just the first Fox News related story for today. Let's now go into the second one. Okay, so today I want to have a conversation with you about the facts of the 2020 Democratic primary. The fact is that right now, today, March 4th, Bernie Sanders is the Democratic frontrunner for the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination, period. Okay? Now, let me be clear about what this story is not. This is not a story of me endorsing Bernie Sanders. I've not decided yet who I'm supporting in the 2020 Democratic primary. I've said Bernie is among my top contenders, but this is not an endorsement of Bernie Sanders. This is not a story about who should you support or who is ultimately going to be the nominee. This is merely a story about the fact that if we want to assess who the front runner is as of today, it is Bernie Sanders. And I am going to tell you exactly why in a moment. Now, it's also important for me to remind you, things can and often do change in the point during the period between 16 months prior to the election and the time that the Democratic National Convention takes place. We're about 16 months from the DNC in the summer of 2020. That's when the Democratic candidate will officially be named. Very frequently, the front runner in March of the year before is not the eventual nominee. Things are very different now, of course, than they have been in the past, but that's just sort of a word of reality that right now it's very often difficult to know who is ultimately going to be the nominee. I believe that Bernie Sanders is now the front runner along three different lines. Number one, name recognition. Number two, polling. And number three, fundraising. When you look at those three categories in concert, Bernie Sanders is the undeniable front runner. So let me lay it out for you first, and then we'll kind of talk about the implications. We'll start with polling. When it comes to polling, polling isn't everything. Polling isn't always exactly accurate. But taken in the aggregate, when we look at polling before Bernie declared that he was running and after Bernie declared that he was running, Bernie Sanders is the front runner out of the candidates who are officially part of the race. Now, why am I mentioning that last part? Because of Joe Biden, okay? Joe Biden is actually winning most polls. He's just not a candidate right now. If he becomes one, then we will have to revisit this. But if you look at a list of recent polling that has been done, the Morning Consult poll has Bernie ahead with 27%. Remember, there's like 10 plus candidates. The DCYFOR poll has Bernie at 14%. That's actually in the lead out of the candidates that have declared. The Harvard-Harris poll has Bernie at 22%. The Harris-X poll has Bernie at 12%, ahead of Kamala Harris by only 1 percentage point. That's from before Bernie even announced his candidacy. The Morning Consult poll from February 17th, also from before Bernie even announced, had him ahead at 21%. And Emerson College from before Bernie announced also had Bernie with a plurality of support at 17% out of the candidates who are running. It's important to know that in all but one of these polls, Joe Biden is ahead of Bernie Sanders, and in some cases significantly so, even though he hasn't declared his candidacy. We're going to get back to that at the end of this story. So that's polling. Polling isn't everything, okay? What about crowd sizes? Crowd sizes also aren't everything, but being able to be a primary candidate this early on and garner significant crowds is an important thing. Bernie Sanders held his first rally over the weekend in Brooklyn. Massive crowd outdoors in the cold, on a day that it had been snowing off and on, an estimated crowd size of 13,000. So that is also a point that we should be considering. But we know crowds can be deceptive and don't actually tell you that much. What does tell you a lot in our system is money, fundraising. Bernie Sanders raised more than $3 million in the first 8 hours of his campaign. That more than doubled Kamala Harris's entire first day. He's expecting to hit 1 million website signups of people who want to be either participating in the campaign or kept up to date on news about the campaign. And his fundraising is absolutely off the charts. That's a really, really important factor. And then lastly is name recognition. And this is a really, really interesting one, because if you think back to 2016, Bernie Sanders had relatively low name recognition. Yes, he was known to people who had political shows, like the David Pakman show. He was known to people in the Northeast disproportionately, but he did not have significant name recognition. And in part, that's probably why he was really working uphill for a huge portion of the campaign, just to get anybody on corporate media to even pay attention to him. Contrast that to now, the beginning of the 2020 election process, of the people already running today. Is there anyone we can say, Pat, has the name recognition of Bernie on the Democratic side other than maybe Elizabeth Warren? I mean, I can't think of anybody else. It's not Booker. It's not Kamala Harris.
I was going to say that. It's not Kamala Harris. I don't think it's Booker. It certainly isn't Amy Klobuchar. I think Bernie Sanders is number one by a long shot.
I believe at this point, Bernie Sanders also has the name recognition advantage in this primary. So I don't think that there is any substantive case to be made that there is a different frontrunner at this point in time on March 4th of 2019 than Bernie Sanders. Now, that's the situation today. How can things change? What are we paying attention to see where this is going to go going forward? As I mentioned before, number one, usually the frontrunner in March of the year before the election doesn't end up being the nominee. That's a historical argument. Historical arguments against Donald Trump were made and they failed. So that's merely a historical argument that says Bernie is not going to be the ultimate nominee, but everything is different in the era of Trump. Number two, Joe Biden. If Joe Biden enters this race, I believe he's instantly the front runner based on current polling. I would actually expect more support for Joe Biden if he ends up declaring, because as we saw with Bernie, when Bernie formally announced his candidacy, his support went up in polls, and Joe Biden is doing really, really well in the national polls. Number three, what is the role of the DNC going to be here? We know that there are different degrees that people claim the DNC affected the 2016 primary. There are those who say they may have preferred Hillary, but ultimately she got millions more votes than Bernie anyway, and we can't say that it was merely because of the DNC that Bernie lost. There are others who say Bernie would have been the nominee were it not for the DNC. Whatever your position is on that issue, there's an open question as to in what ways will the DNC get involved in the 2020 Democratic primary. And number four, and maybe most importantly, remember that there are foreign and domestic efforts to create infighting among Democrats and among supporters of the different Democratic candidates. We can't allow that to succeed. The media, even despite its best efforts, if we're charitable, covers Bernie in a way that they play into the idea that he's bad for Democrats, that he's bad for the left. We don't know what Bernie versus Trump would mean. We don't know who would have won in 2016 had it been Bernie versus Trump. And I can assure you that people in corporate media definitely don't know what the meaning of Bernie versus Trump would be. So that's kind of where I am on this right now, Pat. One side note is, as far as Elizabeth Warren goes, and as I mentioned, she's one of my top contenders for who I would support. Her campaign is in trouble. And I've been reading some op-eds that suggest her campaign may be far more short-lived than initially imagined, as a combination of how she handled the Native American DNA situation, which was a fiasco, and more generally, her poor interviewing skills. I don't know where you are on this, Pat, but I'm reading more and more stuff that suggests Elizabeth Warren simply is not going to go the distance.
Yeah, Elizabeth Warren is going to be fighting for the same group of people that Bernie Sanders appeals to. And I think Bernie Sanders comes across as a lot more likable, a lot more authentic. He's been doing this for longer, serving in Congress for quite some time. And I think he would have the advantage there over Elizabeth Warren, who's more prone to gaffes, probably not as likable, and is not as progressive at the end of the day.
So get me your thoughts about the Elizabeth Warren thing. But most importantly, here's what I want to hear from the audience about. If you can make a fact-based, an empirical case for Bernie Sanders not being the front runner today, I want to hear from you, right? So that would be a case to understand. This can't be Bernie's not even a Democrat and I don't like him. Okay, that's not what I'm looking to hear from. I know we'll see lots of those comments on YouTube on this video. What I want to hear from you is, David, here's where your facts are wrong about polling, fundraising, and name recognition. That's one possibility. Or, David, your facts are right about polling, fundraising and name recognition. But here is what you didn't mention that explains why Bernie Sanders is not actually the front runner right now. That's what I want to hear from people. And if we get some good explanations, some good defenses of someone else being the front runner, then I'll bring them to you later in the week and we can continue the conversation about it. Make sure that you follow the David Pakman Show on Instagram, where we will be letting you vote on upcoming show segments. The show is on Instagram at David Pakman Show. And while you're there, follow me as well at david.pakman. Huge scandal breaking out over the weekend on my Instagram. I posted a picture of myself eating a burger. And as I'm known to do, I eat burgers, what is by the traditional consumers of burgers known as upside down. And a complete crazy battle has broken out on my Instagram page over the burger fiasco. Am I eating it upside down? Am I not? Is it good to eat burgers upside down? Anyway, you can debate it if you follow me on Instagram at david.pakman. The more serious topic here is Bernie Sanders being the front runner for 2020. And I look forward to hearing from you about that.